What makes a bad coaster?
Oh! Why?
This is a tricky question. There are a lot of rides out there that don't provide great thrills, but they aren't supposed to. Kids rides, family rides, or very old classic rides should not be considered for a list like this. To me, a bad coaster is one that's meant to be thrilling, but it turns out to be boring, painful, or both. I tend to see the good in most rides, so this was an extremely difficult list to put together, but I think I ended up with a good batch of bad coasters. These are the 20 worst coasters I've ridden.
Oh, it's bad.
This is the worst.
Is that bad?
It's not good.
It's real bad.
You are the worst. I hate looking at your face. I want to smash it.
This is gonna be bad.
It's like eating a hot circle of garbage.
Number 20. Grizzly, a wooden coaster at California's Great America in Santa Clara, California. This opened in 1986 with 3,250 feet of track, a height of 91 feet, and a speed of 55 miles per hour. Pretty solid stats. Nothing spectacular, but pretty solid all around. I rode this for the first time in 2018, and I got 2 back row rides and found the ride experience to be pretty smooth. So what's the problem with this coaster? It's boring. The drops are shallow, it wanders around its layout without pulling any forces, and then the ride ends. It would make for a good family coaster if it was meant to be a family coaster, but it's not. It's meant to be a thrill ride, and that's why it's on this list, and it's one of the coasters I identified as needing the RMC treatment. Number 19. Goliath, a Vekoma giant inverted boomerang at Six Flags New England in Agawam, Massachusetts. And this one is really sad. I was on the second public train on opening day when it opened as Deja Vu at Magic Mountain back in 2001, and this was one of my favorite coasters. As of 2017, it was still in my top 50. After the 2011 season, it was removed from Magic Mountain and shipped to New England where it reopened as Goliath. It was given new trains. It used to have the Vekoma trains that had staggered seating like you would find on some B&M Hypers. But Six Flags New England felt that this was complicated and caused confusion for oncoming riders, and they were actually right about that. So they adopted new trains from Premier Rides that has the standard 4 across seating, and these are awful. I rode this one time in June of 2015, and it was so rough that it was unbearable. The once excellent Deja Vu has been turned into a monstrosity and delivered one of the worst coaster experiences I've ever had. Number 18. Vortex, a B&M stand-up coaster at Carowinds in Charlotte, North Carolina. Every company needs to get started somewhere, and usually those first projects are not very good. One of B&M's first projects was Vortex, a 90-foot stand-up coaster with a little over 2,000 feet of track and a loop and a corkscrew. I rode this once in 2018 and chose not to re-ride in 2019. It knocks you around, especially in the second half, plus it's a stand-up coaster which makes it naturally uncomfortable. This ride was short, pointless, and most of the 2,000 feet of track caused pain. So after one ride, I was pretty much done with this coaster. California's Great America converted their Vortex stand-up coaster into a floorless, and I actually enjoyed it. So I think that Carowinds should look into doing the same. Number 17. Shockwave, a Togo stand-up coaster at Kings Dominion in Doswell, Virginia. You will see a few defunct coasters on here, and they're defunct for a good reason. Shockwave is actually one that had a longer duration at the park, lasting 29 years between 1986 and 2015. I rode this once in 2008 and felt that one ride was good enough. This has similar stats to Vortex, 2,200 feet of track, 95 feet tall, 50 miles per hour, with just the one inversion. One inversion on a stand-up coaster. That means the rest of the track is full of airtime hills, turns, and a helix, which is just a bizarre layout when you're in the stand-up position. This was the last Togo coaster to be removed from the US, leaving just one in operation, and that is, well, I won't be giving that one away just yet. Number 16. Anaconda, an aerodynamics looping coaster at Kings Dominion in Doswell, Virginia. Now this ride has a bad reputation, but does it really deserve it? I say yes and no. I didn't find the ride to be rough, but the layout is just stupid. It starts with a very shallow drop into an underwater tunnel, which is pretty cool, and then into a loop, and then a sidewinder, which is kind of like an Immelman. But then you awkwardly bump into the mid-course brakes, and it seems like the next few elements are a showcase of bad aero transitions. I'm not even sure what to call this series of turns between the mid-course and the corkscrews. It's not a helix, it's just kind of pointless and weird and awkward. They could have added more inversions here instead and made it maybe a 6 inversion coaster rather than a 4 inversion coaster, but they made their choice. Despite the ride not beating me up, it still wasn't very good and it earns a spot on this list. Number 15. Mean Streak, a Den Corporation wooden coaster at Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio. For my first 3 visits to Cedar Point in 2002, 2008, and 2016, Mean Streak was the laughingstock of the park. In a park filled with spectacular coasters, Mean Streak always loomed in the back as the ride that you would eventually make your way over to ride just once for the credit or for the experience. It opened in 1991 with stats that would impress even today. It had a track length of 5,427 feet, standing 161 feet tall and reaching 65 miles per hour. But this layout was just pointless, full of shallow drops and drawn-out turns on an extremely rough track that would shake you every inch over that mile plus of track. I rode this 3 months before it closed forever, and now stands as the framework for the world's best coaster, Steel Vengeance. It's weird to consider that this plot of land is now the most popular area in the park, when in the past it was a ghost town when the monstrosity Mean Streak was still operating. Number 14. Son of Beast, an RCCA wooden coaster at Kings Island in Mason, Ohio. Speaking of wooden monstrosities, one of the most infamous coasters ever built opened at Paramount's Kings Island in 2000. The first wooden coaster to clear the 200-foot barrier and feature an inversion, a 118-foot vertical loop. Despite the impressive stats, this coaster had a ton of problems. I rode this back in 2002 in its 3rd season of operation when it was still in its original glory, which included the Premier Rides trains and the loop. After the 2006 season, the trains were replaced by the Myrtle Beach Pavilion Hurricanes trains because they were lighter, and they could not complete the loop, so the loop was removed. But when I rode it, it was still in its original form, and this thing was unbearably rough. Going 78 miles per hour over poorly constructed wooden track was not fun at all. Plus, the ride had 2 massive helices, including what was known as the Rose Bowl, which were rough and not very exciting. Between the roughness and the boring layout, this was a failure through and through, but I'm still glad that I got to ride it before it was chopped up and eventually closed forever in 2009. Number 13. Mighty Canadian Minebuster, a wooden coaster at Canada's Wonderland in Vaughan, Ontario. I've ridden this once, in the back row, in 2018, and I knew it didn't have the best reputation, but the out and back layout looked like it could be a good airtime-filled ride. It has over 3,800 feet of track, stands 90 feet tall, hits 56 miles per hour, so it has pretty solid stats. Now mind you, I rode this at the end of my day at Canada's Wonderland after riding a lot of bad rides, so my tolerance was pretty low. But this ride was pretty miserable. The thing I remember most was the jackhammering on each valley and literally bouncing around in my seat. After the out and back hills, the ride hits a straightaway into a long drawn-out helix, which saps the coaster of the rest of its speed. It was just as bad as its reputation suggested it would be, if not worse. Number 12. Psyclone, a wooden coaster at Six Flags Magic Mountain in Valencia, California. Even though there are a lot of woodies on this list, I really do like wooden coasters. So when I would visit Magic Mountain back in the early 2000s, I would always get my rides on Psyclone. But what a terrible coaster. One of its problems were those heavy fiberglass trains that were designed by B&M, the only wooden coaster that B&M ever designed trains for, and it's probably for the best. This coaster was modeled off of the Coney Island Psyclone like so many other coasters, and some of those are actually really good, like Viper at Six Flags Great America. But this one was just crazy rough, and it closed after its 16th season in 2006. The plot of land is now used for a better wooden coaster, the GCI Apocalypse. I have a lot of memories with Psyclone, but by no means was it a good coaster. Number 11. Corkscrew, an aerodynamics looper at Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio. This was one of the country's original modern looping coasters, opening in 1976, and it opened up as the first coaster with 3 inversions. This ride looks spectacular with its corkscrews going over the midway, but the ride itself has not passed the test of time. Everything from the trains to the transitions are uncomfortable. Its 2,000-foot layout starts with an 85-foot drop into a strange airtime hill, then a vertical loop, and then it turns into the iconic double corkscrews, then it glides into the extremely long final brake run. For such a short ride, it's very uncomfortable, and it's hard to find a ride that's more outdated than this. It has a lot of historic value, but it may be better to look at than it is to ride. Number 10. Manhattan Express, a Togo looping coaster at the New York Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada. Alas, the last operating Togo in the United States. As bad as its layout is, it's a pretty iconic coaster, being a fixture of the Las Vegas Strip since 1997. It stands over 200 feet tall and features two large drops as it wraps around from the back of the hotel to the front, where most of the coaster becomes visible to passers-by. This is where you go through the vertical loop and then the dive loop, which is very intimidating for the GP. Then it has a bunch of bunny hops and turns as it tries to fill out the rest of the layout. So this thing is interesting, no doubt, but why is it in my top 10 worst coasters? The transitions on this thing are embarrassing. They make aero transitions look genius. This also has those over-the-shoulder restraints that will cause you to bang your neck every time you hit one of those bad transitions, and this happens a lot. Finally, the layout is bizarre, especially after the dive loop, as you go into a bunch of repetitive bunny hop elements that don't provide any forces at all. There aren't many coasters in Vegas, and it's a shame that the biggest one is such a pile of Togo. Number 9. Ninja, an Aero and Vekoma looping coaster at Six Flags St. Louis in St. Louis, Missouri. This coaster was doomed from the start. It originally opened as Scream Machine at Expo 86 in Vancouver, Canada. Aerodynamics started the project, but when they fell into bankruptcy, Vekoma took over to finish it, and I don't think either company wants their name on this thing. It only operated at the Expo for a few months before it was dismantled and eventually sold to Six Flags and opened at Six Flags St. Louis in 1989. This has similar stats to Anaconda, and it also has 4 inversions: the loop, the sidewinder, and the double corkscrew. The first part of this ride absolutely jackhammers you, especially on that sidewinder, but the one cool thing about this ride is the insane head chopper with a lift chain right above your head coming out of the sidewinder. The rest of the ride is really jerky, and the track profiling just isn't good, so this was definitely a one and done for me. Number 8. Roar, a GCI wooden coaster at Six Flags America in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. My first ride on this was back in 2008, and it wasn't bad. So when people were talking about RMCing the Roar at Discovery Kingdom and eventually at Six Flags America, I was skeptical. But I finally got back on this in 2019, and it was terrible. I thought the layout was kind of boring, pulling some laterals but nothing else in terms of positive or negative Gs. And the whole ride was a headache machine. Six Flags has not done a great job maintaining this coaster since it's only 21 years old, and it's one of the rougher wooden coasters I've ever ridden. I did give this 2 rides on my last trip, one in the back and one near the front, and both were bad. This is a slam dunk RMC candidate for Six Flags in a park that desperately needs it. Number 7. Wild Beast, a wooden coaster at Canada's Wonderland in Vaughan, Ontario. I actually went into this coaster with decent expectations since it doesn't have that bad of a reputation, but I got off thinking it was one of the worst coasters I'd ever ridden. Between the 2 Woodies at Canada's Wonderland, this one takes the cake as the worst. It has a pretty simple double out and back layout that delivered nothing except roughness. When I'm riding a coaster, I want some kind of redeeming factor to make it worthwhile. I've ridden some insanely rough coasters that don't make this list because they're actually fun once you get past the pain. But all the Woodies on this list failed to deliver those redeeming factors, and there's no point in riding them. Number 6. The Vekoma Suspended Looping Coasters, or SLCs. I want to single out a few here as the worst of the worst. Mind Eraser at Elitch Gardens, Mind Eraser at Six Flags Darien Lake, and Kong at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. I've ridden a bunch of others that weren't quite as bad, and I want to exclude Riddler Revenge at Six Flags New England because it has the vest restraints, which every SLC should switch to immediately. My biggest gripe with the SLCs is the fact that the whole time you have to ride defensively. You can't enjoy the ride because you need to make sure that you keep your neck stiff and your head still to avoid headbanging. And unlike most coasters with over-the-shoulder restraints, the ones on the SLCs will always be right next to your ears, so there's no avoiding the headbanging. The layout on these are pretty good, starting with the rollover inversion, which is specific to these SLC models, and then a sidewinder, and then a double inline twist, which goes right over the sidewinder track, and that results in a cool foot chopper moment. If they switch to the vest restraints, you can enjoy these rides without having to ride defensively. So hopefully, if these parks choose to keep the SLCs around, they invest in the new restraints. Number 5. Predator, a Din Corporation wooden coaster at Six Flags Darien Lake in Buffalo, New York. There have been a lot of bad wooden coasters on this list, but Predator is the worst one. The funny thing about this ride is that after the first drop and the first hill, I actually thought that I was going to want to re-ride. But then the rest of the ride happened, and it was among the worst coaster experience I ever had. This opened in 1990, and I think 30 seasons is more than enough for this thing. And given Six Flags history working with Rocky Mountain construction, I think they would do everyone a favor by turning this awful wooden coaster into a world-class hybrid. However, if they were just to give us a GCI retracking, it could be a decent ride. Like I said, the first drop and the first hill provided good airtime, it's just the rest of the ride was so terrible that it ruined the whole experience. Number 4. Flashback, an Intamin space diver at Six Flags Magic Mountain in Valencia, California. When I first started getting into coasters and going to Magic Mountain back in 2000, Flashback would always taunt me because it was never open, but I really wanted to ride it. It couldn't operate during the summer because it was so loud that it would disturb the water park that it sat right next to. So once winter 2001 came along, the ride reopened and I finally got to ride it. And what a pile of garbage it was. You board the 4 across trains with the hard over-the-shoulder restraints, climb to the top of the hill, then go on a straightaway into the first hairpin turn. These hairpin turns were really all the ride was about, and they weren't fun or exciting, and it caused an incredible amount of headbanging. This ride was jerky, and every quick transition would slam your head into the restraint. It was a pointless, terrible coaster that closed forever in 2003 and was eventually removed in 2007, but I am glad that I got to ride it a few times. Number 3. Windjammer Surf Racers, a Togo looping mouse at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California. My first few trips to Knott's as a kid came in the late 90s, and the shiny new ride at Knott's was Windjammer Surf Racers, a dual-track looping coaster. Each side would drop into a vertical loop, and then the rest of the ride was full of bad transitions and jerky turns and shallow drops, and pretty much was a headbanging machine. This ride also had so many issues that it was closed all the time, and Knott's even sued Togo for $17 million in damages, which they eventually lost. This ride only lasted for less than 3 years before being demolished and eventually replaced with the first Intamin accelerator coaster, Accelerator. This coaster was a failure for Knott's, and an even bigger failure for anyone who had to ride it. Number 2. Time Warp, a Zamperla Volaire at Canada's Wonderland in Vaughan, Ontario. In July 2018, I finally got to ride my first Volaire, and I was expecting the worst. One thing I didn't expect was the constant pain that this ride would inflict on you. This was an early attempt at a flying coaster model, and I'm sorry Zamperla, but you failed. You stand in these cages and then they go into a flying position, and the whole time your head is being flung back and forth, and I had to plant my face on the padding beneath my chin to stabilize it so I would stop crushing my head throughout the whole layout. This was definitely a one and done, though when I come back to the park, I think I'm going to get another ride on it just for sheer morbid curiosity. Number 1. Green Lantern First Flight, an Intamin Zack spin at Six Flags Magic Mountain in Valencia, California. There's only one coaster I swore off riding forever, and that coaster was Green Lantern. This ride really has 2 elements: straight sections where nothing happens, and sections where it tries to rip your head off. And when I say rip your head off, I'm not talking about this in a good way like El Toro, I mean it more in a torture chamber kind of way. It was painful, uncomfortable, it wasn't fun, and I actually thought it was dangerous, which is why I swore off riding it. The jerkiness and G-forces on the ride make me think that I was going to explode a blood vessel in my brain, so I figured it wasn't worth the risk for such a terrible ride. It's been standing but not operating for 2 full years, and its future is unclear, but it might eventually reopen after being retracted, or it'll be retracted and then relocated, but whatever ends up happening, it currently stands as the worst roller coaster I've ever ridden. So thanks for walking down Misery Lane with me. Let me know what your least favorite coasters are in the comments below. Also, please leave a like and be sure to subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you all next time.
Garbage.